Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the ABT Time podcast. This is going to be a unique episode in which I'm flying solo. Because of our timing, it doesn't work out for this episode with my co-host, Jen Martin, in Melbourne, Australia. So we're doing this one on a Sunday morning with my wonderful guest. We're just going to have a one-on-one chat here. This is one of my all-time heroes, and people listen to me criticizing so much of the science world and everything else in our society. They tend to ask at times like, well, who do you believe in? Who do you think is awesome? And this is one of my number one heroes, especially from the world of journalism, investigative journalism. So my guest today is going to be Mark Dowie. But before we start the conversation with him, I have to kind of set this all up with a personal story that leads into why I met him in 2005, basically tracked him down. So this is a story that begins in the summer of 1980. And that summer, my girlfriend at the time and I lived in Washington, D.C. for the summer. I was working in taxonomy at the Smithsonian Institution that summer. She had an internship with a large project called the Alaska Lands Coalition. And that was 20 some environmental groups that had come together in the late 1970s to get behind this giant package of legislation that had been assembled basically to lock up Alaska. Alaska had been massively exploited throughout the 1970s. The oil industry in particular had gone up there and just caused all kinds of oil spills and beginning to devastate ecosystems. And so the environmental movement pulled all of their muscle together. And I think it was really ended up being the single biggest environmental action in the history of this country. And they put together a huge package of legislation. Then that summer, all of these different groups led by the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society, 20 some organizations basically set aside all of their interpersonal politics. And as a coalition, they rented these crummy, beat up, rundown offices a few blocks off of Capitol Hill in the kind of the wrong direction, the really poor neighborhood where they could get cheap office space. And they worked night and day in there. And she was part of that working night and day. And I went and volunteered in the evenings and basically put stamps on envelopes and wrote addresses and all that sort of stuff that you did back before there was an internet. And everybody worked round the clock selflessly, just their hearts dedicated to this, trying to save a major chunk of nature. The whole effort was massively victorious. At the end of the summer, there was a big vote and it succeeded. Everything was passed. I remember we went to this big reception in the Rayburn building and all the congressmen were there. Just several hundred people had all worked on it. And John Denver was there. They showed his movie Going Up to Alaska and he sang his song in pure joy. And it really was a vision of the finest moment of the American environmental movement on the eve that fall of the election of Ronald Reagan, which reversed everything. And my guest is going to talk a little bit about what transpired then. So that was what I had as a snapshot for how environmentalism worked. 22 years later, I teamed up with my marine biologist buddy, Jeremy Jackson, who I've known for 40 some years, and we had as a guest on here about a month ago. And we teamed up together for the idea of a communications campaign for the environmental community around this new term, shifting baselines. And so my first instinct was to try and create something kind of in the image of what I saw in that summer of 1980. And I began recruiting all these large environmental groups to be partners in this Shifting Baselines Ocean Media project. And they did sign on one way or another. But as we got going, I began to realize something had changed. And I made these trips to Washington, D.C. and would meet with these communications directors and began to realize that most of them didn't even really know what their organization was about. These large NGOs, many of them were only there for a few months at a time. They began to look like the Hollywood model, which I'd gotten to know in the mid 90s, which is all these large organizations that people basically owe them only 6 to 9 months of their life. You know, you take a job and then within 9 months, you're welcome to move on to the next organization, no long-term commitment. And more importantly, was just the realization of they really weren't into the spirit of collaboration. They had become kind of eco corporations, in my impression. And they mostly were concerned about just branding, getting their brand out there, their logo, to the point where I did this big Jack Black PSA with 20 comic actors that was really high-end project that was a piece of media for the whole Shifting Baselines campaign that was hugely successful. But one of these major groups, NRDC, their lawyers contacted me and said, you are not allowed to put our logo on this thing. You know, we don't care if we've signed on to your project, whatever. And hearing from lawyers about all of this basically non-collaboration spirit over and over again, it got so frustrating and got to the point where I was just complaining to friends endlessly about this. And then one day, somebody, one of my friends, gave me a copy of this book that was published in 1995, written by Mark Dowie, my guest, titled Losing Ground. And let's see, let me get the actual subtitle straight. American Environmentalism at the Close of the 20th Century. And the voice of that book just grabbed me. I imprinted in my media connection with the books of David Halberstam, and particularly his book, The Powers That Be. And the voice of Losing Ground was so similar. Just this really powerful narrative voice telling the story of these events, helping us make sense of what had transpired and how the American environmental movement had morphed from exactly what I saw, that beautiful vision in 1980, to what went on under Reagan in the 80s, and then what came out the other end in the 90s and what I was experiencing at that point. So I was so blown away by the book that I just, as I tend to do with a lot of these guests I'm having on here, when I really find something like that I find impressive, I just turn into a stalker and track them down and introduce myself one way or the other. And I did that with Mark, and I eventually managed to convince him to come down to Los Angeles for Earth Day in 2005, put together an event at USC. We had a panel discussion that Jeremy Jackson was on the panel. Had him stay with my good friends, the Cummins family. He became buddies with all of them, with Paul Cummins, who was the founder of the Crossroads School. They turned out they were soulmates and just had a great time. And most importantly was during that visit, I had Mark just sit down in the library in the Cummins' beautiful house in Pacific Palisades. And with my cameraman, just filmed about a 20-minute discussion with him, which I eventually cut down into a 6-minute video, and then got the folks at Grist magazine in Seattle to post the video along with an article on their website. And the video, I'll find the video and we'll post the link along with this podcast episode, because it's still a great, great video. And there's so much truth in that video as Mark talked about some of these dynamics in the American environmental movement. And one of the things that he went into in detail was about what had happened with Conservation International when Gordon Moore, the billionaire founder of Intel, gave $280 million in a single, as Mark said, in kind of the most misguided gesture of philanthropy in the history of this country. Just gave them this big chunk of money they didn't ask for and they didn't know what to do with, and they wouldn't share it with anybody. And so they had $280 million just sitting there, not being used effectively. The net result of that video was that it was called Empowering the Grassroots. He talked about how we really should put more effort towards the grassroots organizations. Their efficiency is so much greater than these large NGOs. It was a critique of the large NGOs. And not surprisingly, Peter, what was his name, Seligman, who was the head of Conservation International, was furious about it, the video, and had people asked them to take it down at Grist because it was just critical of them. They don't like that sort of stuff. But that was a great, great video. And in the years since then, Mark ended up doing some teaching with Jeremy Jackson at Scripps. We've been buddies over the years. He's visited me a couple of times. He's come down here to Los Angeles, a great writer, investigative reporter. And another book that he wrote is about Haida Gwaii. We'll get into that. It was a tremendous book as well. And that is my lengthy introduction. So Mark, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fine. Good to see your face, and good to get in touch with you again.
You betcha. And where are you coming to us from in Northern California?
I live on Tamales Bay, about 4 miles outside of Point Reyes Station, at a little village called Willow Point, which consists of 8 houses and a small motel. That's where I live.
That's amazing. And, you know, I hate to do straightforward linear biographies of people, but sometimes they're so interesting that I ask that. Can you give us just a little bit of starting point of your education and how you found your way into investigative journalism?
Sure. I was conceived in Mexico, born in Canada, and have lived in the United States most of my life. So I describe myself as a North American. And I've drifted around a lot, and I've done a lot of different things in my life. I've been a copper prospector, a working cowboy. I've been to 8 institutes of learning and have no degrees and no diplomas. So I'm kind of an autodidact. That's the way I describe myself, as a drifting autodidact.
Wait, hang on there. 8 learning institutions, no diplomas?
That's right. The 8 include preschool and nursery school, and my parents moved around a lot, so I went in and out of schools. And no, I have no degrees and no diplomas.
Gee, many Christmas. And wait a second, you were teaching at UC Berkeley, right?
Yeah, right. Well, there's a word that described my ability to land jobs. Can I use this word on the air? Bullshit.
Of course. Yeah.
So I bullshit my way into everything I've ever done, including being a journalist. And so yeah, I'm an accidental journalist. I have no training at all in journalism, but I got good enough at it to teach it myself. So
Well, and I forgot to even up front there, I should have mentioned that book, Losing Ground, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. So he's really accomplished investigative reporter. And weren't you one of the co-founders of Mother Jones?
yes.
Okay, so we'll get into that. But all right, you've already hit me with my first shocker. And you did not graduate from college.
I did not, nor high school.
Jesus,
it's a lot. I don't want to bore your audience. I'll tell you about it next time we see you. It's a funny story, and I'll tell you about it later.
Well, wait, if it's a funny story, don't tease the audience with that. Come on.
No, it's really, really, Randy. I mean, it's also a long story, and it has nothing to do with environmentalism.
Okay. All right. Let's see. And sorry to get specific about this, but you're 82 now, is that right?
That's right.
And so you are from a generation where it was possible to make your way in the world without diplomas and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. No,
Yeah.
I moved to San Francisco in 1960 something, early 60s. I came off a ranch in Wyoming. I bought a suit. I went downtown. I walked into the Bank of America, and they hired me as a teller right there. Right. And I worked my way up to really an executive position at the bank, and then and went to school, studied economics, and became a working economist without getting a degree.
So you're born in 1939?
I have an ABD in economics. You know what that is? You should. You're an academic. It's all but dissertated. Okay. Well, really, I started reading dissertations when I was at graduate school at Berkeley, and I just took one look at this. I said, I never want to write like this ever.
Oh, geez.
So yeah. I did not want to get trained in writing like that, academic. So I just dropped out right there.
Yeah. Let me toss out one little thing that I'm saying nowadays and ground truth this with you, but one of my little hobby horses is this short paper written by Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park. Before he left the biomedical world, he published a short note in 1975 called Medical Obfuscation, Structure and Function. And he talked about how bad academic communication is in general. And in the short discussion of that, he said, 100 years ago, it wasn't this way. We communicated better than we do today. Do you agree with that? Was that as a society in general, the communication 100 years ago was better and clearer than what's going on nowadays?
I'm not quite that old, Randy, but
no, I know, but just from what you know from the literature, right?
I think so. Yes, I think it was clearer, less obfuscated. Absolutely.
Yeah. Why is that not held up as a societal concern and goal and topic of discussion? There's no discussion whatsoever in broader discourse about the idea that our communication skills have gone straight downhill. And the point that I'm making nowadays is that these IPCC reports, it's really well documented since the early 90s when the IPCC was first founded and they began putting out their summary for policymakers. The quality of reading of them has gone straight downhill. And 2 weeks ago, we had John Sturman from MIT as a guest on here, and he had a short note in 2008 about this and then said today it's worse than ever. What is going on with our society that we're slipping into this oblivion of communication and nobody's even talking about it?
Well, I have a theory about it. That all of the professions that have been trying to get a hold of their share of society have developed their own language to communicate with each other. Yes. So what you and I do, a lot of what you and I do is teach journalists, scientists, lawyers and everything how to communicate with the general public. I mean, you and I have done that at Scripps. That's what I do at Berkeley. I teach a class there, a science class, teaching scientists how to communicate with the public. That's what's happened to our overall language, is that the professions, to protect themselves, have developed their own internal language, which contains a lot of really bad syntax, a lot of really bad grammar, and a lot of words that mean nothing to anyone but lawyers and scientists.
And I think along with it, they've also just kind of subconsciously agreed to not talk about this as a large scale problem. I think there's a basic vibe of, well, we're now working on that so hard. We've got all these programs on communication, but they're losing ground. What a perfect title, for your book. And just everything is just keeps slipping in that same direction without anybody standing up and saying, look at the overall trend. There's no awareness of that. And then a lot of people say to me, oh, man, nowadays these kids, they communicate so well with social media. We're just creating a whole generation of really good communicators. No, you're not. It's the polar opposite. The kids are communicating worse than ever. They're communicating non-narratively day in and day out. They're just on social media, just saying and not structuring any narratives at all. And which again leads me back to, for example, losing ground. And what grabbed me with that, and you and I were trading emails last week, and I was giving you, I think in some ways, one of the ultimate compliments, comparing your voice to David Halberstam, who just, I just worshiped that book, The Powers That Be. And it's about the narrative brain that you did you grow up in Wyoming or wherever in a storytelling culture?
No, I was a working cowboy in Wyoming, but at college, I ended up majoring in English because I liked writing. And and I had a great creative writing teacher. That's really, I learned to write in college.
Well, wait a second, but you didn't finish college.
No, I didn't, but I did 4 years, but I walked away. I had a good job and I didn't need to graduate. So I did not finish the, what they call comprehensive examinations. So I just walked away.
Which university did you go to?
Denison in Ohio.
Oh yeah. Wow.
And then I went out west to British Columbia, became a copper prospector. So I didn't need a college degree for that.
Well, there you go. It's through all that real world experience that shaped your mind to be able to tell stories in the real world.
That's right.
And yeah, didn't get all glommed up with the academic stuff. And that's, God, I mean, that's why fishermen are such good storytellers. They're out there on the water all day long. They're not sitting there. Geez. And so then tell me how you eventually began to find your way into investigative journalism, and at what point did you converge on Mother Jones?
Well, I had worked in San Francisco, starting small companies to employ people who've been in prison, and I did it really. It was survivor guilt because I had a felony conviction for draft resistance, and
I was going to bring that topic up. Okay, great. Keep going.
Yeah, I had a bunch. So I knew a bunch of people who had served time, draft resistors. I didn't. I escaped prison, but so I started getting survivor guilt as these friends of mine were coming out of prison. So I started a program to get them employed, and the best way to get them employed was to start small businesses. So I'd started a bunch of small businesses. Usually, I called them labor service or construction service businesses. Wrecking, hauling, all of that, the kind of stuff where you didn't have to be a member of a union. And but they were businesses. And so a friend of mine named Paul Jacobs, who had left Ramparts magazine to start a new magazine, said, listen, the people that have left Ramparts to start this new magazine are really, really good editors, but they don't know how to add and subtract. So would you come in and basically be the business manager? So I was the business manager of Mother Jones.
What year was that?
75.
Wow.
75. So I was signing the direct mail to build circulation, and I was promising in the direct mail, or we were promising, to do a lot of heavy hitting investigative stuff, particularly corporate investigative stuff, and we weren't doing it. So I broke the firewall and crashed an editorial meeting and started complaining to them about the fact that they weren't delivering any of the thing that we were promising, which was hard hitting investigative stuff. And they said, well, that's really hard stuff to do. We don't know how to do that. And I said, listen, you can walk in the door of any corporation in the world and find a story, any corporation. And they said, okay, wise guy, do it. So I went after A.H. Robbins' company for what they had done with the Dalkon Shield, killed a whole bunch of women around the world.
Oh God, and, I remember that. Right?
Yeah. And that was my first big story. And they said, hey, do more. So I started doing it. Even though I was still the general manager and became the publisher of the magazine, I was also doing a lot of the investigative work. I did the Pinto story and a bunch of other big stories that really put Mother Jones on the map. So I'm an accidental journalist. I kvetched my way into journalism.
It just makes me think of the Saturday Night Live one time in their weekend update in the mid-70s, that one of their headlines was about chariots of fire. It was the story of the Pinto.
That's right.
And I had a Ford Pinto that I drove and lived out of in the mid-70s. And for anybody who isn't aware of that story, the Ford Pinto was a moving bomb that if you got rear-ended, the gas tank was in the back and all set to explode, and people burned up in fires in that poor car. Let's jump back a little bit. So born in 39, that means that by the mid-60s, you were 25, 26, and then you got drafted?
Yeah. Well, that's a long story. You know what I mean? Because a foreign student at an American university has to register for the draft. And I was a foreign student, right? I was Canadian. I was going to Denison University. And I, to be honest, I didn't know I had to do it, but I wouldn't have done it anyway. I just thought that was ridiculous to be drafting foreigners just because they were getting educated in America. So I did end up, I was convicted of draft resistance. Felony draft resistance. Yeah. And they didn't even tell me when they convicted me on a plea bargain that I was copying a plea to a felony. So I ended up with 2 felonies and living in a 3-strike state.
Oh my goodness. Wow. You know, that was such a painful time there and so unfair. And I'm a prime example of how unfair it was, because I turned 18 in 1973 and they ended the draft in 72. And in 72, if you didn't register for the draft, they came and arrested you and threw you in prison. And they ended that draft so damn fast. It was so unpopular that by 73, I was stupid and didn't even know when I was supposed to do something like that. And when I turned 19, because I hadn't registered, I got this summons to go to my local draft board. I went there and I had to sign a form that promised I wasn't a communist sympathizer. And that was it. And there was no legal ramifications. So they abandoned all that horrible stuff that ruined so many lives of young men. Just a year before me, I was the first generation that just, skated out of there and didn't have to have any awareness. And I remember the juniors and seniors in my high school that were facing life and death of getting drafted and whether they're going to go over there and get killed in Vietnam. What a disaster. And so then you ended up, you just had that felony on your record, but then you still do, exactly. Did you go back to Canada to get away from the?
Yeah, no, I did. I went to British Columbia and became a copper prospector.
Oh, I see. I got you. That was those years there. That's amazing. And then how long were you with Mother Jones?
11 years.
Wow. Yeah. Huh. Jiminies.
Yeah, eventually I turned my role as publisher over to other people, and then I ended up having a big fight with the first female publisher of the magazine, who I'd hired to be my general manager when I was publisher, and I walked out, and that was in 1985. Yeah, and I went freelance, and I've been freelance ever since.
At the height of the Reagan era. All right. Well, then that's a good segue into Losing Ground. And, part of what I love so much in Losing Ground was your opening on Earth Day, 1970, and setting the stage. And, correct me if I get this wrong, but the Earth Day 1970 had a bipartisan spirit to it. Weren't there 2 senators that had come together to support some of that stuff? And then, of course, Nixon there had even signed the national NEPA, is that right?
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about that, the opening of Losing Ground.
Well, Earth Day, 1970, I was Gaylord Nelson, and I've forgotten the name of the other senator, and a guy named, what's his name? Randy Hayes, right?
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. And he was a young guy at the time, and he opened an office in Washington and set up this whole thing to do Earth Day, right? The one day of the year when we celebrate the Earth, and it would be an annual event and everything, and big demonstrations and it it worked. I mean, it drew attention. I think that any organization with the word Earth in it is a good idea. So Earth Day, Earth First, whatever. I think we we have to look at now more than ever. We have to look at this in a planetary perspective, or we're not going to get it right. This is a floating ecosystem in space, and if we don't see the environment that way, we're not going to get it right. So I like the idea, but you know, and I weave the history of Earth Day through this book. I come back to it time after time after time, because every Earth Day occurred in a different perspective. I mean, things in the environmental movement had changed, things in the environment had changed, things in government had changed. So every Earth Day had a sort of different perspective, a different meaning, a different initiative. And it's a good way of tracking the history of the environmental movement through Earth Day after Earth Day after Earth Day.
Well, and as a matter of fact, in a few minutes, we'll jump it all the way up to the present with Nancy Knowlton, the work she's done. But let's stay going with the timeline there. Tell us about the transition into the Reagan era in 1980.
Well, I mean, as you said, you know, Nixon, who David Brower actually described as the environmental president, for reasons that have nothing to do with protecting the environment, signed a lot of really good legislation into law, including NEPA, but also the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and really, really powerful legislation that, if activated properly, could have really done a lot more than it did. But the legislation's there because Nixon signed it, and he realized that that there was. I don't think Nixon cared about the environment. I think Nixon cared about this new movement that was forming in the country, that was going to be a bunch of voters, that he could, if he wrote some legislation, he could get those voters. So he was right.
Clearly. By the way, side note, have you ever seen the Showtime documentary they did years ago of Elvis and Nixon?
No.
Oh my God. I'm going to dig that up and send it to you. That is one of my all-time favorite documentaries. And there's a similar vibe to it, which is that Elvis hit this point. I think it was in when was it? 70 something 2 or something like that, where his popularity was kind of at an all-time low. And he got all bummed out, and he'd been made a marshal of Memphis or something like that. And on his own, he took a taxi to the airport and decided he was going to go see Nixon. And he flies to DC and shows up at the White House to talk to Nixon about these hippies. And then Nixon's out of town, so he flies to Los Angeles, hangs out in Sunset Strip, and then comes back to DC. And eventually Nixon's back in the White House, and they bring him in. And oh my God, it's the best documentary. And then the final thing, and it's all told in surreal tones by the journalists that were there and witnessed this whole thing. And they keep saying, we couldn't make this stuff up. And there's that iconic photo of Nixon and Elvis sitting there shaking hands in the Oval Office. And the final scene of it, I think they acted out fictitious because there was no transcript of the whole scene. But it was the same thing, which was Nixon wanted to try and use Elvis to get to understand these young people.
I remember the photo.
Remember the photo. They did a whole documentary around that photo. It was just such a good movie. But it's that same thing with Nixon and all of his paranoia. And so, to track back to what you're saying there, for him trying to understand these environmentalist hippies.
Well, I mean, Nixon was the consummate politician who would shake anyone's hand for a vote. You know that.
Yeah, exactly. That's hilarious. Okay, so then take us to 1980 and what happened with James Watt in particular and all that craziness.
Yeah. Well, the first day in office, Ronald Reagan described himself as a sagebrush rebel, right? and put a cowboy hat on to do it. And so that's where James Watt comes out of the Sagebrush Rebellion. He was their lawyer, and he made a perfect interior secretary for somebody who had just declared himself a sagebrush rebel. Even though, Ronald Reagan had sat on a horse for some photo opportunities, but he was as far away from being a real cowboy than anyone I know. Anyway, so he hires this guy who becomes one of the most embarrassing cabinet members in history, right?
Really?
Yeah, right.
Immediately cancels the Beach Boys concert, right?
Oh yeah, no, and everything, and just insults everybody, and
right.
and tells black people jokes on public airplanes, and it was terrible. Anyway, Anyway, and that's they basically tried. The sagebrush rebels wanted the federal government to give all the public land back to private ranchers and miners and everybody that were exploiting the public land. And that's what his assignment was, to do that. Fortunately, he didn't pull it off, but or we would have lost a lot of public land. But that's what the sagebrush rebels wanted. That's what they still want. And they're still out there, the Bundy family in Nevada, and they're still after it.
And Watt did sell off a lot of national park land, things like that, didn't he?
Well, and leased it to miners and drillers and explorers and ranchers and everything. I mean, the ranch I worked on in Wyoming was a public land ranch. I mean, we had a little small deed, 160 acres right in the middle of BLM and Forest Service, and we grazed our cattle all over public land, and that's still happening. I'm embarrassed to say, although my family got out of public land ranching and are now in private land ranching, but they're still there. Well, they went up to Montana for a while. Now they're back in Wyoming.
And so then tell us about what happened with the American environmental movement in response to Reagan and James Watt and by the way, also Ann Gorsuch, right? And
yeah,
it's her son now in the Supreme Court, Neil, right?
Yeah. You're refreshing my memory about a lot of stuff that slipped away, but
bad memories, right?
Well, old memory. So I mean, the American environmental movement is actually a really, really interesting movement because of the number of times it's evolved into a very different movement than it was previously. So it began really with a bunch of ruling class people protecting their hunting grounds. And then it went from there into sort of romantic wildland conservation. And then it evolved into an effort to protect charismatic megafauna, big, beautiful animals. And then from there to, I guess the scientists came in at that point. And so biological diversity became part of the initiative. And then all of a sudden we realized that we were killing ourselves with poisonous gases and chemicals. And so then the pollution became part of the environmental initiative. And then eventually climate becomes the binding force of conservation and environmentalism. So changes in the ecosystem and changes in the politics of the country turned this 6 or 7 times from a very, very different movement to another very, very different movement, all under the rubric of environmentalism.
But when Reagan and Watt came in there, what happened with the donors? There was an equal and opposite reaction where money poured into the environmental movement like never before, right?
Yeah, well, go back to Earth Day and Gaylord Nelson and Randy Hayes realized that there was a lot of corporate money that was looking for ways to green itself. So they raised a lot of money from corporations to support Earth Day and to support things that were going on in between Earth Days. A lot of greenwashing money came into the environmental movement. And the foundations realized that they had to get on board. The big industrial origin foundations like Rockefeller and Ford realized they had to get into the action, so they started pumping a lot of money in. And then the what I call the Green Group, the 25 largest environmental organizations in the country, discovered direct mail as a fundraising mechanism and started flooding our mailboxes with photographs of charismatic megafauna to raise money for their organizations, and they were very successful at it. They raised a lot of money. They still are huge, very well-funded organizations with very expensive offices in Washington mostly, and they're there, and they're still a driving force in the environmental movement, although not the force we need, but they're there.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little dirty trick on you here that I tend to do with guests from time to time, which is you know all about the central work that I've done on this singular narrative template of and, but, therefore. And and you came out with Losing Ground in the mid 90s. Can you give us the one sentence and but therefore narrative of what that book was about?
Wow.
I know
Well,
you can do it.
I mean, you when we were talking before we went on the air, you put the word history into the subtitle. It is a history. It's I mean, the way you introduced me, I was an investigative reporter. A lot of my material ended up in history books, and I realized that a really important role for investigative people is as historians. So I became an investigative historian, and it was so what I would do. And here's an example. What I would do is I would look into a large institution that had used a lot of self-generated mythology to build itself and create itself. And I'd go back in and re-examine the mythology that had been used to build the movement, or the whatever it was. Conservation refugees was a way of investigating the conservation movement, the global conservation movement, which had displaced millions of people in the interest of conservation. So that's an investigative history. The Losing Ground, in a way, is an investigative history of the environmental movement. That's the way I would describe it.
Okay, but so what's the but in the narrative of it? So, you know,
I'm not familiar enough with your ABT.
Well, it's as simple as, you know, we had this great environmental movement developing and it was doing some good things, but what was the turn? And I think it's pretty cut and dried in Losing Ground.
Well, you know, as I talk about in the book, and you and I have talked about a lot, the environmental movement became initially, and to a degree still is, genteel, white, and polite, and never developed or accepted any of the tenets of successful social activism that other movements embrace. So it is, yes, now there's an environmental justice movement, and yes, it's a broader movement than it was in 1995 when I wrote that book. But basically, environmentalism and conservation and everything is still largely genteel, white, and polite. So those are and I think that's a problem for the movement. It didn't form alliances with other social movements. It didn't form alliances with people who were dealing with some of the consequences of bad environmental practice, like poverty.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. Last year in the ABT course that I now run, that we're in our 17th round, and it's usually 30 to 50 participants. And the National Park Service has been partners for about 8 or 9 of the iterations of it. So we've done a lot of stuff with them. And last year, we dug in a little bit on the issue of diversity and the National Park Service. And last year, over 4th of July, one of the guys in the course actually spent the whole long weekend digging through the statistics and doing the numbers and showing very clearly that they had developed an initiative about, I think, 15 years ago to improve diversity. That exactly what you're saying, the National Park Service, 2 things: their employees are disproportionately white, and the people that show up at the parks are disproportionately white compared to, you know, demographics of America. So they put together an initiative to try and improve that. And in the 15 years since they started that initiative, it got another like 10% even worse. It's more white than ever now, the working staff of the National Park Service, and then the people that attend the parks as well. And they just don't really even know how to address that. It just kind of sits there at this point. So many of the patterns. Yeah.
So, I mean, here's a footnote about that. Until sometime in the early 1920s, the national parks were closed to people of color. It was whites only, it was posted whites only. And the Sierra Club, which was probably the only democratic organization in the whole, the Big 25 Green Group, they voted, they had their members vote on whether or not that was a good idea to have the national parks be whites only. And the membership voted, yes, it's a good idea. So that's that's part of that history, right? The parks were closed to all the white people.
Yeah. Then tell me, without bothering with the ABT then, but basically your title, Losing Ground, what did you mean when you titled the book that?
I didn't title the book that. MIT did. And what's interesting, when that book came out, 2 other books named Losing Ground came out at the exact same time around the world. One was by Charles Murray, who made himself famous by writing The Bell Curve.
The Bell Curve, yikes.
Yeah.
Okay.
He wrote a thing called Losing Ground, was about how we were losing ground in education. And the other was a Swedish book, was translated into English by a child psychologist, and it was called Losing Ground. So there were 3 books floating around called Losing Ground at once. And MIT, I don't know, they just came up with that title. And you know, book publishers get they reserve the right to put any title they want on a book. I didn't fight them. I thought it was okay. I'd actually forgotten what title I had on the book as a working title, but Losing Ground's okay.
When I read it in 2005, one of my good friends with Environmental Defense Fund referred to you as a malcontent and just said, yeah, you know, we know his criticisms of the large NGOs. Did you deal with that for a lot of years?
Oh, yeah. I'm still dealing with it. I mean, yeah, Russ Mittermeier, who was the president of Conservation International, where Pete Seligman worked, who you mentioned. Yeah. He has described me more than once as a raging pain in the ass. So yeah, no, and I am. I mean, that's part of
which is what draws me to you. It all becomes clear at this point.
It's what investigative reporters do, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, people don't like to have the truth thrown in their face like that when they're holding up a big facade. And you know what I saw by 2005 was just the staggering amounts of money that these eco corporations, is the term I felt was appropriate for them, were bringing in. I remember I think it was your Conservation Refugees book that you opened by painting this beautiful picture of the scene of the yacht in the bay in New Guinea, I think, with everybody flying in helicopters of all the CEOs of those big NGOs and getting together and having their little getaway retreat. Can you refresh us about that scene?
Yeah, that was sponsored by Conservation International, put together by Pete Seligman, who incidentally, I think is a really interesting character. Someday I'm just going to do a profile of Peter Seligman, mainly because he's probably the best fundraiser anywhere, but certainly the best fundraiser in the environmental conservation thing. And something you mentioned, Gordon Moore putting money into CI at the very beginning. And it was actually Seligman who went to Gordon Moore, invited him up to go fishing. They both love fishing in Montana. And this is a great story. And so Gordon Moore listens to Pete Seligman describe this organization he wants to start called Conservation International. And he says, how much money are you going to need to do this? And Seligman, without batting an eyelash, said, $1 billion. And so Gordon says, you know, how about $500 million, right? How about 500 million? And that was his initial commitment, incidentally. He only put 280 in at first, but his initial commitment was $500 million. So Pete says, well, that's the fastest $500 million I ever lost. To which Gordon Moore responded saying, no, that's the fastest $500 million I ever lost. And it was at the time, and still is the largest single check or commitment ever written to probably any social movement in the country, but certainly to environmentalism. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And Seligman has gone on to raise, billions more.
Well, interestingly, on a little side note, about 3 years ago, some good people at the University of Oregon had me come there for several days and give a big keynote address thing at their annual speaker thing. And they had just been given similarly, I think it was 500 million from the Nike dude. What's the guy's name that, founded Nike? He's a University of Oregon alumnus. Mm-hmm. And that guy gave them 500 million and said, here, build some sort of institute for science. And it was a similar sort of thing, which was nobody asked for it there. I mean, maybe Seligman asked for it for CI, but it sounded to me like they didn't really have a plan on how exactly we're going to. I think this is a really bad thing when people don't have the plan of how you're going to use that much money. And that was what that interview I did with you in 2005 in that little video you were talking about, was that it just was way beyond what they knew what to do with. And rather than sharing it with other groups, or Gordon Moore rethinking it and giving them 140 million, which would have been plenty, and then 10 million each to 14 other groups, it was the same thing. And so then they had me meet with the people in this Science Institute thing that was coming together there and talk to them about some ideas. And I began to pick up this vibe that they were all kind of terrified, like, we're going to be given all this money and we're going to have all this financial responsibility that first thing that happens when you get that kind of situation is wastage. And the next thing you know, scandals and everything else. So I don't know. I didn't want to have anything to do with something like that, where you get more money than you asked for. And I think that's what went on there with CI. What's your assessment today of the big three: World Wildlife Fund, TNC, and CI?
Well, there's still the big three, aren't they? There's two more in there. The one my favorite is the African Wildlife Fund, which sounds like it's an African-based organization to save African wildlife, when in fact it's another one with a headquarter in Washington. It's an American organization. It's got nothing to do with Africa, but except that African wild. But back when I did Losing Ground, I looked at the numbers a lot, having had a little training in economics. So at that time, the 25 largest environmental organizations in the country, and at the time there were about 5,000 environmental organizations in the country. The 25 largest were pulling in over 70% of the environmental dollars being spent in the country. I'm not sure that ratio has changed much, frankly. I don't know. I haven't looked at it recently, but they still have gigantic budgets, huge salaries. CI salaries are all mid-six figure now. These guys are just pulling down huge amounts of money, and people who are doing grassroots environmental activism around the country, if they have a salary, it's like maybe 20,000, and so with no benefits.
Okay, but let me stop you on that, because doesn't it just mirror the American economic model that Reagan implemented in the 80s and has persisted ever since then, of this kind of log normal distribution of a few people that are super wealthy and then tons of people way down there? Didn't the environmental movement end up just taking on that exact same structure?
Well, yeah, and with the same whole idea that things would trickle down. The whole is based on trickle down theory. That
exactly.
A lot of wealth at the top, the money would trickle down to people at the bottom. And I think that the environmental movement believed the same thing, that if you made these 25 organizations super rich, they would draw money into the movement. Well, they did, but they put it in their own bank accounts.
Yeah. Well, one sad little moment for me was that with shifting baselines in 2004, when I put together that coalition supposedly of the 20 some groups and went out to DC, and the one group that was the total outlier is the Surfrider Foundation, which I've always absolutely loved. They're based in San Clemente and California, and so on the other coast, and they have a structure that is not nearly as hierarchical. It's more kind of cellular. They have 50 chapters around the country. And I was always a huge fan of theirs. And they were one of the three kind of founding groups that we put together to start shifting baselines. And the head guy, well, the first guy was Chris Evans, and then he was replaced by Jim Moriarty, who was a great, great guy. And one of the things I loved about that group was they just called their head guy the director. They didn't have the CEO label from the corporate world, but then you go to DC and all those giant NGOs, they're all got their big CEO who have, as you say, the big CEO salary and the giant office and all that stuff. And I always loved that about Surfrider. And then I went to one of their events and we went out for beers, and Jim turned to me sheepishly and he said, "I know you're going to hate me for this, but we just changed the name of my position to CEO." And I said, that just really disappoints me. Now you sound like all the others, but they're still based there in San Clemente, which is great and keeps them from being just the inefficiency that goes with those large NGOs. And by the way, another little tidbit, I'm sure you'll relate to this, about probably 6 or 7 years ago, there was an event, a big shishi event at a billionaire's house in Hollywood, big TV guy, I won't mention who, that somebody accidentally invited me to it. And it was a special thing for these two doctors who there was a Pulitzer Prize winning book called, I think, Mountains Among Mountains. And it was the two doctors in there about their work in Haiti. And they were from one of these small kind of boutique disaster relief groups. And it was in the living room. There were a whole bunch of celebrities in there, and the guys were just standing there talking and everything. And then the Q&A, somebody asked, it was all about the Haiti disaster, the earthquake there, and how they were trying to save lives. And somebody said, what about the NGOs, like Red Cross and things like that? And these two guys just paused, they looked at each other, and then they looked back at the audience. And one guy said, don't get us started on that. It's the saddest story in the world. And then the other guy said, I can't tell you how many times we've been out there in the countryside in Haiti trying to patch these people up, trying to find enough little ingredients from 5 different black medical bags. And we look over on the horizon, there's 10 white SUVs, brand new, with all these youngsters from some disaster relief organization with tons of money driving across the countryside. Just the wastage that goes on. And as I listened to that description, all I could think was, wait a second, that's the same thing that I've heard from the environmental world, the wastage that goes on with these large NGOs. And it makes you just realize it's in the DNA of humanity that if you've got these big issues, you're going to have these giant organizations, and they're going to have obligatorily huge amount of wastage. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with your analysis of it completely. If you think about what people like Peter Seligman have to do to keep an organization like Conservation International afloat. I mean, this is a country with offices in 80 countries. Yeah. They have fleets of planes, cars, and as you say, big white subs and everything. They've got a huge infrastructure that has to be supported constantly. Yeah. Pete Seligman doesn't have time to think about conservation. His whole life is thinking about keeping this gigantic thing afloat, right? And really, I mean, Big Green, with the 25 largest American environmental organizations, throw on top these big 5 bingos, the big international NGOs that run conservation. This is a probably now pretty close to $1 trillion operation. And all of the people who are running them, all they get to think about is money. They don't get to think about the environment. So that's, I mean, and these are allegedly the best minds in the organizations, which is why they're put at top, because they're the best minds. Well, what are they doing? They're not doing anything for the planet. They're not doing anything for the environment, right? They're just filling up the coffers so they can buy more planes and boats. I mean, and rent big boats in the South Pacific to take rich people on diving trips.
What's tragic was that Michael Crichton, who a year before he died, I spent 4 months trading emails with him when I was making my film Sizzle. He was such an amazing guy. I spent a lot of time now trying to get people to understand the science world lost a huge opportunity with him. For 25 years, he was available as a communications resource, and he eventually just lost his patience and jumped ship and became a climate skeptic. And tragically, he wrote this garbage book, State of Fear, in 2003 or so, that was just an indictment. It was just a cockamamie, fictitious indictment of the environmental movement, the idea that environmentalists were staging these crises to raise money. So just this huge cynical streak all the way through it. What's a tragedy was that the guy wasn't a comedy writer, because there could have been a great comedy written with that storyline. But instead, his thing was this bitter thing. And in my emails, he finally forced me, and he said, I'm not trading any more emails with you until you read the book. And it's just terrible. But there's a comic edge to all that sort of stuff that has just never quite been exploited. But we got about 10 or 15 minutes left here. And so now we're going to take a shift to the happier side. So we've been through all of our angst and Sturm und Drang and everything to do with the environmental movement and losing ground, that sort of stuff. Let's spend the last little section here talking about, in about 10 years ago, I did a visit to University of British Columbia and Victoria, and at dinner, like the first night, everybody was raving about Haida Gwaii. And oh my God, Haida Gwaii this, Haida Gwaii that. I didn't know what the hell Haida Gwaii was. I just knew there was just this blissful about this, like Eden or whatever it was, this heavenly place called Haida Gwaii. And then you wrote a book on it. And I just raved. I love that book. And you brought once again, your tremendous storytelling narrative voice. And you wrote this book in the tone of trying to help other people dealing with these indigenous rights issues and things like that. Tell us the basics of how you happened to write the book on Haida Gwaii. And everybody listening, you really ought to get a copy of it from Amazon. It's a great, great book. So tell us about the Haida Gwaii book, Mark.
Yeah, so I was doing, in my work, one thing leads to another. So I'm writing a book about conservation refugees, and I'm traveling around the world visiting indigenous communities that have been affected by conservation. And after a while, I visited over 100 communities around the world, every continent except Antarctica. And people started asking me every now and then, a shaman or a chieftain or a leader would say, "Do you know about the Haida?" And I would say, "Yeah, I know who they are. I lived in British Columbia, et cetera. But why do you ask?" And they would all say the same thing, because we want that what they have.
Mm.
So I came back and I said, "Well, what do they have that you want?" And they said sovereignty and title. So I came back and went to visit Haida Gwaii, which for when I lived in British Columbia, it was called the Queen Charlotte Islands, named after a British queen who never set foot on the place.
Exactly.
But living there for 13,000 years before the Brits grabbed it, were the Haida people. And they are an amazing, amazing people. I mean, anthropologists who pick their favorite indigenous communities very often pick the Haida for being totally amazing. And they're amazing because every indigenous community excels at something, and that's how they've survived, whether it's, you know, carving or fishing, or they already, the Haida excel at everything. I mean, they're just amazing, amazing people. And they decided about 50 years ago that they wanted sovereignty and title over this archipelago, this amazing archipelago of 230 islands in the North Pacific. No one's ever heard of them, right?
Yeah. Where is it? So I was an undergraduate at University of Washington. I knew all about Queen Charlotte Islands on the map, and so then that's a bizarre thing. I was there at University of British Columbia, and everybody's talking about Haida Gwaii, and I like, what? Where is that? And it was I did know where it was. How many miles north, kind of west of? It's not that far from Vancouver, right?
Oh, it's way north of Vancouver.
Oh, is it? How far?
The only mainland you can see from Haida Gwaii is Hawaii. You can't see British Columbia from Haida Gwaii. So
wait, slow down there. You can see Hawaii?
I'm sorry, Alaska.
Thank
right.
you. Whoops.
Right.
All right. You just my mind around
a senior moment. Yeah.
All right.
You can see Alaska from the northern point of Haida Gwaii.
Okay.
And it's just this amazing, amazing archipelago of islands that the wildlife biologists who spend time up there call it the Galapagos of the North, because it actually has more biological diversity than the Galapagos does in the southern part of the Pacific. It's just amazing place, a very, very diverse. And then there's these people that have been living there for 13,000 years who almost got wiped out by smallpox and other diseases, but survived, and they're rebuilding their population. Now, they were up to 15,000 until the diseases came in, and now they're rebuilding. There's about 3,000 of them living on the islands now. And of course, the logging companies discovered these islands and came in and started clear cutting them. And that's really what initiated the struggle for sovereignty and title that started about 50 years ago. And when you were up there, they had just become Haida Gwaii again.
Yes. That's what it was. That's why everybody's talking about it. Right.
Yeah. And they basically, when they got sovereignty and title, they renamed themselves. So to what they've been for like 10,000 years. Haida Gwaii is the name of the place, and the name of the people that are there are the Haida. And they are an amazing, amazing community of indigenous people. They don't like the word tribe. Most tribes don't. So I don't use the word, but there they are. Yeah, it's
and they keep a pretty tight control on access to the place now, right? It's you can't just come and go up there.
Well, no, you can. I mean, it's public. It has and this whole southern part of Haida Gwaii is one of the most amazing national parks in the world. It's owned. The land is owned by the Haida. It's owned and operated jointly by the Haida and the National Park Service of Canada. And unlike any other park in the world I've seen, there's absolutely no pavement. There are no trails. It's all just, and there are about 6 people living in the park, and they're the park keepers. It's not with a big park headquarters with a museum. They're just these 6 indigenous people that live there, and you go and visit them, and they show you around the park. It's an amazing, amazing national park. And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to read something to you.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Can I do that?
Of course, of course.
It's
Yeah.
very short. I just have to find it here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love that book.
Yeah. So the basic argument for self-determination, sovereignty, and an Aboriginal title, which is their one, it's fairly simple. And so what I did was I went around, when I was traveling around the world, I asked people for their complaint, basically what, if they had filed any kind of petition for sovereignty in their country, I wanted to read it. I wanted to see it. So I've synthesized all of the over 100, I found over 100 petitions for sovereignty from people around the world. And a lot of it, it turns out, was based on the original petition that the Haida put together. So here's the generic. This is the generic petition for sovereignty. You ready?
Yeah, yeah.
We have lived here for a very long time on land that we have always assumed was ours. We were here before you discovered us and our homeland, which we have never left. For all this time, we have thrived alone without foreign assistance on the resources of our land and water. Despite the fact that we were secure in our lands, we stewarded in a culture we developed with a religion we owned under laws and life of our own making. You assumed when you first observed us that we were a bunch of ignorant, heathen savages who had no idea how to manage land, forage and cultivate food, harvest medicines, worship our Creator, trade with neighbors, conduct our ceremonies, build homes, create art, or govern ourselves. And you coveted our land and the resources on and beneath it. So you conquered and subjugated us, and behind the superior firepower of your weapons, you assumed title over our land and sovereignty over us. You kidnapped and educated our children, erased our language, sold our resources to others, extinguished our rights, attempted to convert us to your religion, and turned the best of our rituals into crimes. We eventually asked you to reconsider your actions and the assumptions that informed them. You agreed to do so. Amicably, we negotiated an agreement of understanding, or a governance protocol, a land use co-management plan, or a treaty. And amicably, you signed it. But before the ink was dry, you broke it and returned to confiscating our land and selling our resources to people we had never met. While we are close to giving up the idea of sharing sovereignty with you, we have decided one last time to file a claim in your courts where we seek only what we believe we deserve: self-determination, sovereignty, and original title to our lands, not to some of it, but to all that we say is ours. So that's the sort of generic argument for sovereignty that I believe the essence of which any indigenous, and there are about 6,000 indigenous communities in the world now, and 2,500 of them are now fighting for sovereignty, and they're all inspired by that.
And furthermore, that is the plainest, clearest, simplest of communication.
Well, rewritten by an editor, me.
Oh, whoops. Oh.
Yeah, no, I synthesized all of the 100 or more complaints into that argument. I wrote that.
Oh, gee. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Cancel that statement. I'm so impressed that they had written that for themselves. Okay.
Well,
great.
they did, but I took all of their language and put it into a single document.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
But then that's a document you send out to these other groups to give them as a kind of model of what they need to say.
I give them the whole book.
Yeah.
Randy, I wrote this book. I thought that this book would sell like 300 copies to the 300 lawyers around the world who I know who are litigating for sovereignty for indigenous people. It's still selling well. And I sent it to anyone who asked for it.
Yeah, when I read it, I wished it had been published by a giant publisher because it's so beautifully written. And yeah, it's really kind of a magical book. But that said, it's also a book with a lot of character to it, because one of the little darker elements in there was, you mentioned that they did practice slavery once upon a time, right?
The Haida, I believe, are the only non-white community in the world to enslave white people. So they would enslave anybody who attacked them or anybody who coveted their women. But they weren't like American slavery or British slavery. They would basically just bring you onto the island, put you to work, feed you. So I read an account of a slave who'd been enslaved by the Haidas. He said that he never ate better in his life. So they weren't put in chains or anything. They were just kept on the island for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, they were presented with a document to sign, and the document said, "I will never do this again." Whatever they had done, some of them were in there stealing gold and copper out of the rivers. Some of them were in there coveting the Haida women, and whatever they were doing, they'd sign an agreement never to do it again, and they would be released.
Well, it's almost like slavery is probably not the right word. It's more like criminal punishment that they did there, right?
Well, they called it slavery. I mean, because Native people who were fighting in that part of the world, when they would win, they would enslave their
right.
I mean, that's common.
Yeah, that's what I read about in your book, that I wasn't quite as enlightened on that. So it's fascinating. You've got all different.
But they would enslave other Native people who came into their property and tried to steal or attack them. They were ferocious.
Right,
and incidentally, I think ferocity is a really, really guided ferocity is a really, really important part of sovereignty and title. You can't just sit back and ask for it.
Well, on that note, do you see parallels with the Maori of New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. And the Kayapo in the Amazon. I mean, that's a partner. I mean, the Brazilian military are scared to death of the Kayapo because they're such ferocious people. So there has to be a little bit of ferocity in any movement, I think. And I think that's something we've learned from Native people.
And that is a good closing message for you in this awesome discussion. So yeah, let's see, I guess a final little note, what kind of things you're working on right now? You're always, I mean, gee, many Christmas, 82 years old, and you're more busy now than ever before. What's the main thing you're spending time on right now?
I'm actually, as you know, I mean, I had a little audio company called Talking Point Radio, which was making podcasts before the word existed. Mm-hmm. So we called them audio documentaries or audio docs or sonic blogs. We had all these cute names for them. And then along comes the P word. So I go back into business. So I'm doing podcasts. I'm podcasting again with my brilliant producer, Robin Giannatasio Mall, who when I was doing it, got offered a big and better job in New York. And I've got her back here now in San Francisco. So I'm podcasting again.
Oh, that's great. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time here on a Sunday morning to chit chat. And you are just a great storyteller. I mean, you've got that mind, that voice that clearly wasn't shaped by graduate studies and things like that. I think it was shaped by out in Wyoming and out on the range or who knows what, or in the copper mines of British Columbia. But always great to talk with you. And that's what first drew me to you in the beginning, was reading Losing Ground and just hearing that voice in there. And that's the kind of voice that we need from journalists, and especially investigative journalists. So onward.
So, I mean, just one thing on the education thing. I do not put down formal education. I really, I have learned a lot of what I know from the 8 different institutes of learning that I've been to. I just don't think you need to graduate. I just don't think you need to go through that whole thing of comprehensive exams and writing dissertations and everything. Just go to school, learn what you can, get the hell out, right? So that's what I did. So I love the institutes of learning that I was at. I don't put down formal education at all. Some people think I do just because I never graduated.
Yeah, I don't so much put it down as I value the need for that real world experience, and everything that I've done in my work. The most important thing is just being out there, seeing the real world, as opposed to sitting up in higher locations, just making up things about how the real world works. I mean, yeah, we can go on and on about that topic, but that's what I've really valued in the work that you've done, is you've gotten so much out there. And even with that little video I did with you, empowering the grassroots, that was your core message of that, was look at how you told that whole story about the, what was it called? The one on the salmon, the something or other valley, and the efficiency of the environmental groups there in trying
Mattole.
Mattole. Yeah, it's Mattole Valley, right?
Yeah, exactly. Up in Northern California, right?
Yes, a great little story that you told in there, and that is just the truth. I mean, it's fighting that log normal curve. That if only we could shift some of those funds down to these really efficient local grassroots organizations. That's the shame, is to watch. it's the wastage that bums you out over time. But anyhow, keep fighting the fight. Thank you so much for all the writing that you do and podcasts. And we'll put some links when we post this with the stuff that you do. And I'll be talking to you again sometime soon. So thanks, Mark.
Sooner the better, Randy.
You betcha.
Always great rapping with